Welcome back to The Developing Doctor. I'm your host, Dr. Ven. And the whole idea of this show really sits on one kind of premise, which is to use your heart more, not less. And many of us got through medical training, honestly, by turning off our feelings and probably a lot more, or at least our awareness of our feelings and the things around us. And we thought that by doing so, we could be more present for our patients, even if we weren't present for ourselves. And I learned the hard way, and I suspect others have too, that the best care is not provided when we turn off. It actually occurs when we remain on and are fully present as whole people. So my guest today has learned that lesson as well, I think. Her name is Dr. Devina Wadhwa, who is a psychiatrist, writer, and speaker. She spent over a decade caring for people at some of the hardest moments in their lives. And during her career, grief unexpectedly arrived at her door, and it changed how she listens to everyone she sees. We're going to hear her story and learn what it means to lose your heart in this work only to find it again. Davina, welcome to the show. I'm so glad you're here.
Thank you, Dr. Ben. Thank you for having me today.
Yeah, I'm so excited and honored to be able to speak with you and to learn a little bit more about your story. Why don't you just kind of take us back to how you got started in this work in the first place, and maybe where things started to veer off course or when you noticed that?
Wonderful. So I trained as a pharmacist first at the University of British Columbia, and I found quickly that medicine is truly where my heart belonged. So I was fortunate to get accepted into medical school at the University of British Columbia, where I finished my medical training and then went on to finish my psychiatric residency at the University of Toronto. I soon realized that I was gravitated and attracted to smaller communities that were unserviced, that did not have enough physicians to service them. And I ended up settling down in Northern Ontario in a mid-sized community called Thunder Bay. I worked very hard in my first few years as an independent licensed psychiatrist, and that hard work led me to burning out very quickly. I lost my way in medicine. I started to find myself showing up to the job completely emotionally displaced, flattened, not knowing why I entered this work in the first place. And I was disconnected from the way I was feeling. And all I knew was I had worked for over a decade to get to this place of working as a psychiatrist and not knowing where to go. I felt isolated, completely lost, completely directionless. And I didn't know where to veer off from this feeling in terms of, I'm here. I'm finally working in psychiatry, a field I absolutely love. And yet I used to dread entering that building every single day. I used to dread showing up for my patients every single day. And this is one of the most isolated times I felt in medicine. And I think we naturally sort of get to a point where you feel you're at a crossroads in your life. And there were moments I felt that, is it time to quit? Is it time to move away into an urban city where I can get lost into, the daily practices of medicine, but feel much more supported and less isolated because you're in a big city where you're in tertiary care sort of centers and you don't feel as lost and alone. And I don't think that was the fix. I think the fix happened when I really had for me, a tragedy and a huge loss of losing my dad. And it sort of halted everything in my life, including medicine, figuring out what is the purpose of my life and what does life really mean. So I've answered your question in a number of layers, but I think that's where I sort of am now in terms of refiguring out who am I in medicine, what is my purpose, and I've sort of started to find it, and that's where my journey has started, with sharing it with other doctors, because I know we are not alone in this feeling.
hmm I'm going to latch onto that last comment first, and then I want to back up to a few things you said. But, I've heard so many times that practicing medicine feels lonely, right? So we're on these teams where, the leaders of teams, we frequently have colleagues around us, even whether you're in a small setting or a big university setting, surrounded by people. I've heard from many physicians and other healthcare providers that it feels lonely at times, which I think surprises people who are not in healthcare. What is it that you about healthcare or our environment that you think leads to that feeling of loneliness?
I think it starts with training. In our training, we are shown and then we start to mirror the same practice. I remember in my training I was shown that you have to be strong, you have to be resilient, you have to survive sleep deprivation and hunger, and that practice when you are, whether in your 20s or 30s, they're very formative years of your life, and you're still having frontal lobe development of what life means, what life looks like. And we carry this persona of this strong doctor that doesn't need to sleep, that doesn't need to eat, that controls their bladder. Pardon me if that's not appropriate to say on this podcast, right? The bathroom breaks are timed, and you got to hold everything within you. And I think that sort of performance carries on into our life because you become a staff psychiatrist or a staff physician or an attending doc in a tertiary care facility, and you have these models of resilience and holding your hunger and holding your thirst, and they carry on with you. And we lose the humanity that we entered the work with into the first place. I entered medicine because I loved looking after people. I loved this concept of humanity and humanism and caring about people in the deepest way possible. And in 5 years of my practice, I lost that. I became cold and disconnected to the reason why I entered this work in the first place.
Yeah, that is very well said. And it is so true. The modeling, I would say it's the hidden curriculum almost of ignoring just the basic components of being human, right? To feel hunger, to feel emotion, to sleep, to be thirsty, to need rest. All of those things are anyone listening to this, whether you're in your healthcare or not, knows what that feels like. And then imagine being in an environment where you're told to ignore that. And I don't think we're alone in medicine that, there are other careers where that has to happen, but on a daily basis for as long as it happens in healthcare, I think would surprise people.
Absolutely.
So I'm sorry to hear about the loss of your dad. What was it about, that moment? Was it just a wake up call? How did that, I guess, break you out of your shell? Because sometimes people experience a loss or a major event in their life, and it causes them to shut down even more. And it sounds like it caused you to open up almost. And I'm just curious how that happened or what you're willing to share about that.
Absolutely. And I think sharing that is part of it. It feels vulnerable, and yet it's been a big healing journey for me. And I think it's the first inspirations that allowed me to write. And writing has been able to allow me to express that pain and that feeling, and almost this hypocrisy of I've been a psychiatrist for close to a decade, 9 years now, and my training predated 5 years of learning how to become a therapist, learn to be in the therapist's chair, and also being in therapy myself. It was always encouraged in my training to learn how to be a patient in the therapy chair. And so I thought I knew how it felt to sit with people that were experiencing loss, grief, depression that came with grief. And not until the loss of my dad, which happened extremely suddenly, unexpectedly, and tragically, where life I felt was actually going pretty well. I had trips planned with my dad. I had a wonderfully close relationship with my dad, and losing him completely unexpectedly opened up this can of figuring out that life is so fragile and vulnerable, and being able to relate in a truly lived way with what my patients had experienced, and feeling the sense of complete imposter and guilt for maybe the patients that I thought I had served in a meaningful way years before, sitting in the therapist's chair or helping treat their depression related to grief, and truly not understanding what they actually went through when I went through it myself. And I think that sensation allowed me to decide, where do I want to go? I was at a crossroads in medicine. Do I want to find my true authentic self and become the doctor that I entered medical school wanting to become? Or did I want to trudge along pretending to be this doctor that I thought I was making a difference, and I truly wasn't? And I think losing my dad, as painful as it was, 2 years down this journey, I have so much gratitude in a way for the experience, however painful it was, to be able to help shape the future doctor, the future human, and the future person that I want to become.
I think one of the things that you had written was that you understood the language of grief long before you knew the language of grief long before you understood it, I think is what I wrote down. And I think that makes sense on many levels when you just think about how we care for patients in general. So, we don't always know what they experience, but we think that we do on some level, right? We know what we read in the textbooks and we know what is supposed to be happening, but that may not actually be their lived experience. And whether it's emotion or a physical illness or a loss, loss. I guess what surprised you the most about living inside this moment that looking back, you're like, oh my gosh, my patients experienced this exact same thing and I didn't get it until now. Like what surprised you about that?
How painful it is and how vulnerable you feel. And I'm sorry, I may get a bit emotional, but you read about grief and our DSM-5 sort of can easily label it as complicated grief. And that's something that struck me as a psychiatrist, that grief is always complicated. Losing somebody, whether it's somebody or a pet, I'm a fur mom, and losing a pet in our corporate world, the bereavement day a lot of times is 1 to 2 days for losing a pet or 5 days for losing a parent. And grief doesn't follow this clean timeline that society expects it to follow. And I always expected my patients coming struggling with depression, and I thought, yes, let's start the SSRI, let's provide some CBT. It's much more complicated and human than that. And when I experienced it myself, there was this huge sense of guilt for the disservice that I did by labeling it as, complicated grief, because I would have met criteria for complicated grief, even though my relationship with my dad was, I'll say, quote, a good relationship. Losing somebody that's important in your life is complicated, and it doesn't need a diagnosis. It needs the presence and the compassion and the listening ability of somebody to say, no matter what you're experiencing, it's absolutely okay. And whatever it rolls out and looks like in your life, it's absolutely okay. And I think it's taught me a lot about pain and sadness and suffering and depression. And it's validated that as human beings, it's one of the most universal experiences that unfortunately we will experience. It's the price we pay to be human. It's the price we pay to love. And I have sadness for the patients that I missed in terms of truly understanding that. And yet I express gratitude for the patients that I look after now and the patients that I will look after tomorrow and next year, to being able to have had this very difficult lived experience.
Something that bubbled up as you were speaking is I read a line in a book once about the memory of an echo or the echo of a sound or something. And basically it just doesn't end, right? And so I hear so many times where either directly or inferred, there's a wondering of why can't we just get over this? Or why can't we just fix this? And in medicine, we are fixers by nature, whether you're in a very cerebral field or something like cardiology where we go in and you put in a stent and you make it better, right? We just want to fix things. So how do you balance that, the desire to fix versus just sitting with someone in the moment and allowing them to just be, I guess?
I think it's just having our own awareness. And I think in Canada, and I don't know what medical practice really looks like practically, in the States or in other countries, but we're at a boiling point of a crisis where there's not enough doctors, patients are waiting in hallways. And so we want to fix the hyponatremia and move on to the next. And I often think about, my dad's last moments in the intensive care unit. And if those moments were rushed, or if those moments felt that they came with a sense of sort of, I don't know if discompassion is a word, but the lack of compassion, the impact that it would have had on me and my life moving forward would have been drastic. And I think in medicine, yes, it's great to have a fix. And, our patients feel better when their sodium's fixed or we fix their sleep. Yet the emotional residue and the emotional experience is what truly matters. And I think we forget that. And I don't know where it gets lost along the way, because I remember being this medical student that used to go and sit down and listen to our patients' stories. And somehow that sort of got lost and got translated into see the next person, move fast, write your orders, admit, discharge. And I don't know where it gets lost. And I'm sad that it's getting lost. And as a teacher, I teach medical students and residents. That's what I try and infuse in them. Keep that heart, keep that feeling that you entered medical school with, because that is the most important reason that will lead you to stay and continue to love medicine. If you lose that, I think medicine becomes your enemy.
When do you think we lose it? in training because I work with students too. And I sometimes actually find myself having to take a deep breath and count to five because they're telling me something that in the back of my head, I'm like, I have five patients waiting. I don't want to talk about this. But then I remember, actually, this is really important. And so I know that they have it. And I know that I have to remind myself that it's important. And where between like the really eager fourth year and the somewhat crusty, a full professor, like, do we lose it and have to relearn it?
I think when we know what the impression and plan is, and I really thought hard about this, my second year students, my third year students, they come with this beautiful narrative. They actually took time to listen to the patient. And then you see that transition where your second year resident sort of the story matters less, but the impression and plan matters most. And that's what we teach our senior residents to come to us with. Tell me your impression and tell me your plan. And I found that transition for me when I started to become confident in knowing what I thought I knew was going on and what I wanted to do, I lost the story. And now, as an attending, coming full circle back, I'm starting to realize that yes, the impression matters. We need to make accurate diagnoses and the plan matters, but the story matters even more. And I'm learning to go back to that medical student that I was, where the story really mattered.
I love that. Yeah, stories matter.
Stories
Stories
matter.
have power. Yeah.
Yeah.
So what can we do? I mean, I had a similar experience where just sort of an event in my life like woke me up a little bit. So, but you don't really have to experience a loss or have something that happens to sort of gain some of that just emotional awareness or emotional intelligence, or those are limited terms for I think what really happens when we sort of start becoming aware and listening to stories again. But how do you think people can just start getting that back, right? Whatever was lost between the M2 year and somewhere in residency, what can people do to start getting that back right now?
I think we infuse it in the way we teach. I think I infuse it in the way I mentor, I mirror, I teach my students. I leave space for empathy. I leave space for some wellness with my students. It's always like, are you good? Do you need to have lunch before we review it because it's noon? And I think by talking about this and bringing awareness into the world of medicine again will reinvigorate the culture of coming back to our hearts and coming back to the story, because that is ultimately what brought us into this work. And so talking, teaching, mentoring, mirroring, the way I learned to not take a break, not eat, not go to the bathroom, I'm reversing the mirroring and showing my learners that it's okay to eat, go to the bathroom, take a deep breath, have a stretch of your shoulders before you come back to the job. It makes us better clinicians, and it allows us to go back to the story that matters.
Are there practices that you rely on a daily basis or weekly basis or monthly basis to sort of keep yourself well, I guess?
So I am fortunate to for myself have connected to a yoga practice. I'm a yoga teacher, and I also have a mindfulness based practice with just training in psychiatry. So I infuse that in my own life, and I infuse that in the lives of my students and my trainees by little tiny things, the doorway pause between going from one curtain to the next, checking in with yourself. It takes 20 seconds. What are my shoulders doing? Is my jaw clenched right now? Am I holding my breath? Allowing my nervous system to say, hey, it's all right. You were completely present in that one interaction with your patient. You have to let it go. Come back to yourself. You're in a safe place with your nervous system, and allow yourself to fully go back into the next curtain for your next patient. I love the doorway pause exercise. And the other exercise I absolutely love is sort of the transition when my day is done, because carrying medicine home can feel very heavy. And so, for me, this may sound really silly, but changing my shoes. All right, this is the practice where my shoes and changing my shoes into my entering home shoes allows me to leave medicine and work and the pain of my patients at work, and allowing me to enter the next part of my life fully and wholly. And I try and sort of sprinkle these into the lives of my students and my trainees in terms of, figuring out how to be most present in your day, whether it's in medicine, and learning how to leave medicine in medicine and coming home fully.
I love all of those practices. And for the people who are listening who are doubting, I was in your shoes at one point. I mean, I've written about this before, but one of the first things my coach and therapist told me to do when I was going through a burnout and a period of grief myself was to just walk into work thinking of three things I was grateful for. And then I was also given the doorway pause later. And I know that I rolled my eyes and like sighed and thought, this is not going to work. But it worked more than anything else that had we had tried up to that point. And I'm a big believer in all of the things that you just mentioned.
I am too.
So, I want to back up a little bit. You've talked a little bit about story, and I know you're actually in the process of sharing your own story. Why don't you tell us a little bit about the book that you're working on and what it's about and when people can find it?
Thank you, Dr. Ben, for asking that question. After losing my dad, I've always been a private writer. Journaling has been, one of the ways I've always coped and reflected, and it's been sort of very private. And as I reflected a year after losing my dad at the first anniversary of his death, where I was really struggling, I reflected back on everything I had written, and I felt that I needed to put this out there. And it became this story of, what I've called the book, What Lives Through Loss. And it's really my story as a daughter, as a physician who saw the last moments of my dad in the ICU and losing him, and how I allowed medicine to reflect on my experiences as a daughter, but as a physician as well, in terms of what loss looks like, because it is universal. Humanism is mortal. We will all go at some point, and we will all lose people that we love at some point. And so it's a story of my journey, but a journey of what grief is, the unrealistic expectations that sometimes society and our culture has of grief being clean and finite, and yet it's messy and it can show up in many different ways at many different times, and what moving forward in life looks like, and what grace can look like after having a loss. And hopefully will be launching in September of this year, and I'm very excited. It's a piece of my heart. It's a lot of my vulnerability that's come out, and it's allowed me to think that, as physicians, we have this persona, and pardon me for saying we. I've had this persona that we have to be strong and we have to, show that we're resilient, and yet we're just human beings that have our own stories and our own suffering. And my hope is that sharing that vulnerability and that suffering allows physicians in the world to realize that we don't have to show that we're so strong and resilient, and we just have to be human. When we reconnect to our humanism and our heart, I think the best version of the doctor we are comes out.
Oh, well said. Yeah. And I think as I was listening to you speaking, one of the things that I have remember thinking at one point is, I watched people grieve. I've seen, the very wonderful things that can happen in life and the very hard things that can happen in life. We are honored. It's an honor to be able to walk beside people when they do that. And I had this belief that then I was going to be better at the hard things because of that experience. But the reality is they're just as hard no matter what. And I think that's a lot of what you kind of just touched on. What do you hope people take away from this book when they read it?
The fact that, vulnerability and pain is universal, whether we're doctors, lawyers, accountants, whatever the role you play in this world, whether you teach little kindergarten kids, and showing our vulnerability in a world that masks pain. And, with social media, I'm new to social media, I'll be honest, Dr. Ben, where you see a lot of the glamour and you don't see the pain. And by seeing the glamour, it impacts your self-esteem. And when you are in pain and you're feeling vulnerable, it truly impacts you. So knowing that we are all humans and we carry a story, and part of that story is fueled with suffering and mortality, I think it's important in the world we live in today. Normalizing pain is important in the world we live in today.
Absolutely. Yeah, very well said. We've touched on a lot of really heavy things, so I want to pivot here a little bit before we're done. What's one thing that you're looking forward to here in the coming months that, will bring you joy and sort of refill your cup?
My dogs, as innocent as this sounds, I look at them, they are able to live in the moment, experience pure joy in the moment, whether it's on a hike full of mosquitoes or you're climbing to a glacier, the joy is the same. And that's what fills my cup, just reminding myself that life is hard, and yet there's so many beautiful moments just seeing the sunrise every day, and it's magical, and just being able to breathe and be alive is magical, and that's what truly fills my cup and allows me to do the best I can for myself and the world.
Amazing. Yeah. And as a fellow dog lover, I can completely relate. We just got back from a walk with our dogs earlier, and they were so excited to chase the same squirrel they probably chase every day, but it was like the first time they saw a squirrel. And, yeah. So, yes, they remind me the same thing. Yeah. Well, Dr. Wadhwa, thank you so much for your honesty and for sharing your story, and really for being vulnerable and going to some hard places. There's sort of a theme that has come up in what you said and some of the things that you've written, which is that the greatest gift you can offer isn't your expertise, it's your heart. And that's really the heart of this show. And I think the heart of what this conversation was. So, to everyone listening, if today's shows resonated with you, take a moment and sit with whatever it is that you're feeling without judgment, and just allow yourself a few moments just to feel and be. And you can find Dr. Wadhwa's writing on SoMe Docs, Kevin MD, and Healthy Debate. And she also speaks at CME Away events. Her book, which shares more of her story, navigating grief as a daughter and a clinician, What Lives Through Loss, will be available in September 2026. Thank you so much for listening to The Developing Doctor, and don't forget to use your heart more, not less. And we'll see you in the next episode.